murders of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht constitutes one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. No other political assassination in German history stirred public passions and transformed the political climate of the country like that killing on the night of 15th January 1919. In front of a hotel with the paradisiacal name of Eden, their murders marked the prelude to further political assassinations and a great deal more. As Paul Levi observed in his famous plea written 3 years before the victory of German fascism, quote, "Here began that unearthly train of the dead, which resumed its course in March 1919 and dragged on for years and years, murdered and killed." End quote. Luxemburg and Liebknecht's case epitomized a veritable fall from grace, quote, in which murderers went about their work in full knowledge that the courts would fail, end quote. Distortions, obfuscations, aiding and abetting, false accusations, and self-incrimination surrounding the deed would follow for years to come. In particular, the trial preceding the court-martial of the Guard Cavalry Schützen Division, the military division to which the perpetrators belonged, hereafter GKSD, quote, "a travesty of justice which must be described as one of the greatest legal scandals of our century," end quote, transformed the tragedy into a farce in which quite a few social democrats were deeply involved. Although one participant's admission of guilt in the 1920s and several trials in the late 1920s and early 1930s would begin to shed some light on the case, these efforts remain hampered by legal wrangling and political setbacks, leading the renowned historian of German communism, Ossip K. Flechtheim, to conclude resignedly that, quote, "the precise political, moral, and legal responsibility of the various protagonists will most likely never be known," end quote. Yet one of the responsible parties spoke out, at first privately in 1959, then publicly in 1962, betraying secrets and sparking furious protests with the shamelessness of his admissions, while at the same time earning the approval of some sectors of society, including the West German government of the time. The final act of this tragic comedy began when the historian Joseph Wolff discovered the GKSD court-martial files, along with additional files of the prosecution dating from 1921 to 1925, and provided them to the West German journalist and filmmaker Dieter Ertl. Ertl not only studied the files, but also interviewed the dubious responsible parties before turning the affair into a docudrama which aired exactly 50 years after the murder. These actions promptly got him into trouble, and he would find himself involved in 2 questionable trials before Stuttgart district courts in 1967 and 1970 against the men he identified as Rosa Luxemburg's assassins. Ertl lost the case and was forced to retract his accusation. The farce had reached its final, pathetic climax, a climax only made possible because the Social Democratic government in 1919 had no interest in revealing the truth behind this crime. The military court system was in turn able to obfuscate the facts, allowing subsequent lawyers to defer to the seemingly logical and legal actions of their predecessors in a gigantic, monocausal, legalistic chain stretching on for over 50 years. In this process, the sham trial before the GKSD court-martial consistently served as the point of departure, for according to the logic of subsequent lawyers, nothing that had been signed and sealed by a German court could possibly be untrue. This is why so much confusion continues to reign among historians even today. As the scholar Ernest Rudolf Huber knows all too well, quote, "even later efforts failed to adequately illuminate the darkness of the circumstances surrounding the deed," end quote. While Helmut Trotnau's biography of Karl Liebknecht suggests that Otto Runge was the assassin, and Wolfram Wetz's biography of Gustav Nosk's points to First Lieutenant Vogel, whom Hagen Schultz in turn identifies as Liebknecht's murderer. The East German Illustrated History of the German November Revolution would identify Vice Feldwebel-Kroll as an accomplice as late as 1978, who Jakau Drabkin in turn identifies as the lieutenant on the murder vehicle's footboard, while Leonidas Hill reports that Flung Hartung never stood before a military court, and Eberhard Kolb and Reinhard Rurup's compendium of source material from the Central Council introduced a mysterious sailor as the alleged perpetrator. Sybil Quack concluded in 1983 that to advance any definitive statement on the matter would be quote-unquote problematic. Alongside the lack of clarity concerning the identities of the perpetrators, rumors have continued to swirl and reemerge with regularity. Some, for example, claim that leading SPD functionary Philip Scheidemann placed a bounty on the two socialists' heads, while others assert that fellow leading communist Wilhelm Pike, like Judas, betrayed Karl and Rosa on that fateful night. Speculation concerning further potential accomplices also ran wild, and not entirely without justification, as we will see. That even today's politicians are ill-equipped to confront this generalized confusion was demonstrated when the author of this volume presented his findings at a public event and was immediately accused by a well-known member of the SPD and veteran of 1968 of peddling a quote-unquote cock and bull story. Against this confusion, the present volume seeks to clarify specific political, moral, and legal responsibilities for the notorious double homicide. Chapter 1. The Shock of Revolt. The timing and, more than anything, the source of the sailors' uprising in Kiel and other German coastal cities that kicked off the revolution of 1918 to 1919 took the old rulers by surprise. It was, as one historian would later describe it, quote, a spontaneous and elemental revolt from within the armed forces themselves, end quote. It sent the, quote, Kaiser's elite, the naval officers who had hitherto regarded themselves as a kind of knightly order of the German Reich, into a state of shock. Martin Niemöller, an anti-Nazi Lutheran pastor, wrote in his autobiography, quote, I accepted all the horrors of the war as a matter of course, and without being shaken to the depths of my soul. What did shake my soul to its innermost depths and forced me to seek a clear and definite issue for myself was the revolution, which was not merely an upheaval, but a complete breakup. A whole world sank under me at that time, end quote. After overcoming their initial paralysis, these officers had one thing on their minds: revenge. Revenge for the, quote, disgrace, the, quote, humiliation. They were driven by hatred, a deep hatred for the masses, for the revolt, and for those who allegedly fomented it, the Independent Social Democrats, USPD, together with Leibknecht and Luxemburg. Officers began to organize into brigades. One of the most enterprising figures in this undertaking was a young lieutenant who appeared to know everything and everyone. So impressed was the Social Democratic official responsible for the naval and military affairs, Gustav Nosk, that he made him his liaison officer in Kiel, and thus into a pivotal element of the counter-revolution. The man's name was Wilhelm Canaris. He preferred working in the background, in the shadows. Quote, Canaris was fascinated by these cat-and-mouse games with the enemy. As one who had experimented with invisible inks and assumed false names in his boyhood, he was fond of the mysterious, of veiled allusions, and the concealment of ulterior motives and intentions. He also believed that the sailors had been manipulated, that the, quote, Marxist communist foe had surreptitiously infiltrated the fleet and subverted it with the aid of undercover accomplices on board, end quote. A friend of Canaris's established a relatively small naval officers association. These officers were, quote, shock troops, forming in a capital city swept up by the Red Flood around the turn of 1918 to 1919. They were housed at Inn den Zelten, number for special operations, end quote. The name of their leader was Lieutenant Commander Karl Horst von Flungertung. He and his naval squadron were in turn under the command of a division which would play a decisive role in the battle for the Reich. In fact, they were led by a captain whom Canaris also knew very well, Waldemar Pabst, the first general staff officer of the Garda Cavalry Schützen Division. Chapter 2. The Little Napoleon. Originally an elite unit of the Kaiser under the command of Lieutenant General Heinrich von Hoffmann, the GKSD had been deployed to the Western Front in 1918. But since von Hoffmann suffered from a heart ailment, the unit was soon commanded by Pabst, who joined the GKSD in March 1918 on General Erich Ludendorff's orders. Short, vain, ambitious, and thirsty for power, Pabst would become one of the most notorious figures of the 1918-19 revolution. His influence, and above all, his position of strength within the military, have tended to be underestimated in the past. With the GKSD, the quote-unquote remarkable Pabst held sway over the strongest counter-revolutionary military formation, the quote backbone of all deployed troops, end quote, upon which Nosk's authority was based. As soon as news of the revolution reached him, Pabst began driving the GKSD, quote, home in forced marches, end quote, fully intent on sweeping away, quote, the rule of the inferior, end quote. Pabst and the GKSD reached Potsdam's Wild Park train station on 30th November 1918. Here, Pabst experienced his first encounter with, quote, Red Berlin. Volksbeauftragte, or People's Deputy, Emil Barth, a member of the newly formed revolutionary government, had been expecting him. Barth: hey you, come over here. Pabst: hey you, come over here. Barth: I am your superior. Pabst: have you lost your mind? As soon as Barth introduced Pabst to his companions, including the Counselor of Deserters, Pabst lost his composure. Pabst, quote, clear the train platform in 3 minutes or expect a thrashing, end quote. The GKSD set up its headquarters in Nikolasi, near Berlin's Wannsee, and, quote, agreed as a precaution that no unbidden guests would be permitted, end quote. Shortly thereafter, on 10th of December 1918, Pabst marched his GKSD into Berlin through the city's iconic Brandenburg Gate. Nevertheless, the attempted push against the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils, plotted by the Supreme Army Command, with SPD leader Frederick Ebert's knowledge, would fail. The old social order's gleaming defenses were falling apart, and Berlin appeared to be in the hands of the masses. Pabst single-handedly held the GKSD together, at least to some extent, insulating them from all external influences and imparting continuous quote-unquote educational instruction that reflected his reactionary worldview. Thanks to this, the GKSD would be one of the few combat-ready units left over from the old armed forces. On 24th of December 1918, Pabst led the attack on the revolutionary Volksmarine Division, or People's Naval Division, as ordered by Ebert, not hesitating to use gas grenades in his artillery strikes. Quote, yet the thundering of the artillery did not fade away unheard. Quote-unquote counter-revolution by the officers was the echo it called forth. It flew from mouth to mouth, was taken up by the factory sirens, and stirred up the farthest corners of the sea of buildings that was Berlin, and the dragon seed that had been sown over the previous weeks rose up prodigiously. In frantic rage, the unleashed mutiny leapt at our troops. End quote. The masses forced an end to the operation. Pabst had now witnessed the power of the masses at first hand, along with its demoralizing effect on the institution that was the very essence of his life, the army. Rosa Luxemburg's quote-unquote dragon seed had arisen. Germany no longer had a royal army. Nevertheless, Pabst refused to give up. He retreated to the edge of Berlin with what remained of his troops, dismissed the elements, quote, infested with Spartacism, and recruited volunteers to develop a powerful squadron that would be as motivated as he was himself. Disguised as a civilian, he attended gatherings where Leibknecht spoke, and soon identified him as his most fearsome adversary. He became fully convinced of the quote-unquote danger represented by the Spartacists when one of his own officers asked him to allow Rosa Luxemburg to address the brigade. The officer, a Catholic nobleman, had heard Luxemburg speak and quote-unquote believed her to be a saint, a new messiah. With an incredible sense of purpose, Pabst later recalled, quote, at that moment, I completely understood the danger Frau Luxemburg posed. She was more dangerous than all the others, even those bearing arms, unquote. He decided to eliminate her. The outbreak of the January uprising provided the necessary opportunity. Pabst offered Noske his services in the Louisenstift boarding school located in Berlin's Dahlem neighborhood, which had been appropriated for military purposes, and soon became, quote, one of the most enterprising, end quote, assistants, eager to wipe out the quote-unquote rabble-rousers once and for all. That's going to do it for our introduction in chapters 1 and 2 of The Murder of Rosa Luxemburg by Klaus Gietinger. I definitely recommend